Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Dora Rampersad with BluePaz First Responder Services. I'm a first responder and forensic psychologist, and I have the pleasure of being here today with my friend, Sgt Greene from Chandler Police Department. Dan, thank you so much for being here with us today. I know that given the climate that we have right now nationally, things have been very hard for law enforcement, and we have a lot of people who are deciding to no longer stay in the career, as well as trying to balance their family life needs and how this is going to play out for them, as well as the safety of their families. Um, you are in a unique position because you get a chance to train so many officers over the period of time you've been an officer. But even more importantly, I think, and is that you are a human being first, and you have experienced a lot of things in your lifetime, being on the job as well as balancing your family. And this is a segment that we're doing today, which is essentially law enforcement or first responder PTSD by a thousand cuts, and all of these stresses that happen on the job and how they play a part in your well-being as an officer. So I hope that people get so much out of this because you are a wealth of information, and I'm just very honored to be here with you today. So thank you for taking the time to do this.
Thanks for having me, Dara. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your friendship over the last few years. We've gotten to know one another. Our connection was crisis intervention here in the East Valley in the Phoenix area, right?
Yeah.
Got to know one another. I started hosting CIT schools, and it was really nice to get to know you. And then you've been fantastic in terms of keeping a conversation going, and at times creating a conversation that some of us have never had in terms of officer wellness. And like you said, I've been around a while. This is my 24th year of service. And right now I'm the training sergeant with the Chandler Police Department. And in the last couple of years, I have realized just how important this conversation is to thousands and thousands and thousands of us nationwide. So I'm really interested. I'm really happy to help. So just talking it over, and whatever I can add to this conversation, if it's critical and important and helpful, then that'd be great.
That's awesome, man. Thank you for doing this. This is what I wanted to do to start off with your background was telling us some of your background from all the way when you started through patrol, and getting a feel for your background as an officer and how you developed into where you ended up today in the training division. And through that course of conversation, if you could share with us some events that just you remember over the course of time. I like to think of it sometimes like road rash that we pick up along the way, but I know it's so much more than that because it really touches and affects your life. So I'll turn this over to you if you can, and give us that backdrop, please.
I was hired in the era of pagers. All right, that's how far back it goes. All right, one of my first pieces of issued equipment was the department pager, so I couldn't get away from the police department then. All right, so it was 1996 as I got hired, and so I'm in my 25th year of service. And yeah, we titled this conversation "Death by a Thousand Paper Cuts," right? Which is just a common term to kind of relate that over the course of time, you haven't had one or two significant traumatic type of experiences, but you've had multiple routine traumatic experiences over the course of time, which of course begin to add up. So 1996, got hired, again, started with a pager, and I have slowly progressed into the phone era. But clearly we haven't figured out Facebook yet, so I guess that's the next. The bulk of my experience in law enforcement has been in the field. So minus 2 years as a detective, everything else has been in uniform. And I really am, in this day and age, that's very rare because I really support, and I'm a big fan of diversity in law enforcement. I completely get it. It just wasn't my path to go do other things in police work. I really focused on working the field and wearing a uniform and driving the patrol car and serving out in the streets and working alongside my colleagues, most of the time in moonlight. I did about 17 to 18 years worth of working either our second shift or our third shift. And so I guess what I'm saying is my niche in law enforcement has been working the field as a patrol officer or a patrol sergeant. And it wasn't until about 2.5 years ago when I took this position in as the training sergeant when I left the field. So I've had, in my experience there working patrol, I've had my share of paper cuts. So you and I have talked before in the past on how obvious post-traumatic stress can be, how obvious moral injury can be, and overall wellness can be when we speak about officers and firefighters and dispatchers, medical personnel, when they have had that singular traumatic event. And I think that's clear to everyone. I think they understand their post-traumatic stress better when they can put their finger on a specific event. And I think people around them, like family and friends and the department, can understand it better when they can show you, this is what happened to me and this is the effect it's had on me. My experience is the opposite, but I think it's actually the most common experience. And it is that 1,000 paper cuts over the course of time that I can't show you the officer involved shooting because I haven't been in one, and then thank God, and I hope I end my career without one. It hasn't saved me from bumps and bruises and traumatic related injuries, trauma related injuries I've experienced. But I think that might be the most common type of exposure to traumatic stress. So I'm all about the road. I'm all about the uniform. I've always been, in some form or fashion, an instructor in the field. I got my I was first certified as an instructor in 1998, and teaching ever since. The bulk of what I teach right now is use of force concepts. So I've taught that for a long, long time. And I have recently, when I say recently, it's been a decade or so, I've tried to dive into the concepts of ethics and integrity, all things related to ethics and integrity, and now the impact of trauma on ethics, integrity, and decision making in law enforcement.
What an interesting branch that you've gotten into now with talking about with the climate that we have going on nationally, and and the research areas that you're picking up on with ethics and practice and training and trauma. What have you discovered? We're just kind of going off on a sidetrack here for a minute. What have you discovered, or because you're a well-read man, I think you probably read 20 times more books than I ever have, and
probably not.
And so tell me what you've discovered so far as far as ethics and the community climate, and because a lot of this stuff too also has jury by Facebook connotation attached to things, and something that has always caught my attention has been that PIOs and departments are not really allowed to release information that they know would make things better for themselves, because they have to hold that information as being private and confidential. But the public perception of that is that that they're being secretive, or that they don't, or that they're culpable. So the ethical and moral, you mentioned something called moral injury, which is that moral dilemma that they will struggle with as well. And I know sometimes officers feel like they're left hung out to dry, while the administration and background are taking place to try to clear them. So I said a lot of stuff there, but tell me some of your thoughts on that stuff.
So good point. When it comes to being judged and criticized in of social media, I guess is a good way of putting it, right? It's difficult because quite often, from our perspective in law enforcement, we fight that social media fight with one arm tied behind our backs, because we have to be sensitive to the evidence and the facts around a case, and not releasing what we should not release to the public, because it is directly related at times to criminal prosecution or investigations, or the information we release just might violate someone else's right to privacy. So while other people in the community don't have that type of restriction, we quite often do. So we do feel like we, in law enforcement, and of course I'm speaking for law enforcement in general, right? We can feel like we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back for those reasons. So because we fight one-handed, we feel a little beat up. And it's the traumatic, again, it's not the traumatic experience of an officer-involved shooting or a crime scene that is hard to digest image-wise, but it's the traumatic experience of feeling beat up when you feel like I've got an explanation, I've got a defense, I have something to share, but I can't share it with you right now because it would be inappropriate and sometimes unlawful for me to do that. So in the meantime, I continue to take my lumps reputation-wise as an individual and as a department and as a profession, as a law enforcement profession. So I think the idea of post-traumatic stress and moral injury is evolving towards the reality that that type of experience can create post-traumatic stress and can create moral injury, especially in terms of creating an environment that makes me doubt my commitment to the person I joined. For reason I joined, it was a noble reason. Under circumstances like we're working in right now, maybe it's starting to make me doubt my commitment to the profession. And what I want to do in this conversation and at any given time, if anybody wants to listen, is to reinforce the nobility of the profession and if any officer anywhere is having trouble with their commitment, help strengthen their commitment again and remind them about what got them in to the profession in the first place. And that's what I've been trying to focus on for a couple of years now, and now for the past several months. And one of the things I found is that as we experience injury, that psychological, emotional type of injury that's related to a traumatic scene or from the bumps and bruises we've taken reputation-wise as we experience these injuries, it affects our moods. It affects our emotions. There's no way to convince me that it does not. No one is that robotic. So it affects our moods, it affects our injuries, and through my research in the world of psychology, and I am absolutely not an expert, right? But from what I've read, when our moods are affected, our decision making is affected as well. We start to be affected by explicit and implicit biases, and we start to be affected by emotions. And in a book by the name, it's called Emotional Intelligence, Daniel Goleman wrote it. He speaks about a term called amygdala hijacking. So under normal circumstances, our decision process goes through our frontal lobe, and we think about things in a cognitive way. Under emotional, stressful circumstances, maybe under traumatic or moral injury circumstances, the amygdala hijacks the thought process and the decision-making process, and I act out emotionally. And when we act emotionally, we quite often make mistakes. And I want to get out there and I want to tell my peers, not just here in my agency, but everywhere, is to be careful about acting out emotionally. And the more injury we've occurred, or I should say accumulated over time, then the more at risk we are of acting out emotionally because of that moral injury or that post-traumatic stress that we're experiencing. So just through this conversation, I want to prevent officers from going down that road emotionally, because it usually creates a decision-making dilemma.
So Dan, in your experience, you feel like it is possible to train emotional intelligence, getting people aware of their triggers as well as the hooks, and then how they respond to
I'm living proof. So back 24 years, and I'm not this guy. Um, so I like to refer to myself as fat and 47 because that's exactly what I am, right? And at fat and 47, I've developed a maturity level that I think helps keep me not just safe at work from making improper decisions or conducting myself in improper ways, but makes me safe at home too. I mean, this type of emotional intelligence makes me a better husband and a better father. So the goal is to train better emotional intelligence, which equals emotional control, right? So that nothing about emotional intelligence books and training and the expert about it says, I'm training you to not experience emotion.
it?
It's a training of experiencing the emotion and managing it in positive ways. So self-awareness and that's self-regulation. And those two things, we all experience those two things. Some of us ignore it, especially the self-awareness part. So if we can be more aware of our own behavior and conduct and our own emotions, we can start to regulate them better. And it just overall makes you better. So if I'm doing that at fat and 47, what I'm telling you I wish I could do is could have done it at fat and 27. All right. Because I've always been chunky. So I just wish I had known this when I was 27. A police officer, a firefighter, a dispatcher, forensic ID techs out there working the streets, they're going to watch your video. And they are 2 years on the job. And I want them to know that this is where you need to be. Don't take as long as I did to get there. So speed up that maturity process, that maturation process, and be aware that the lumps you're taking in the conditions we're working in right now will indeed have an effect on your emotions. So be aware and regulate it.
It is. Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, because I feel like there are a lot of people. So I know people who are on administrative leave for different things. And as they're on administrative leave, or they're put on to light duty, or they are behind a desk waiting to see what their punishment is going to be for certain things, it takes a toll on them. And so sometimes it's not what happens in the field that may have been a precursor for the issue that happened. But now it's the administrative stress that they're going through. I think that those things add the paper cuts as well, wouldn't you say?
The last part again, what was it leading up to the question? What was that?
The administration, the process of having to work with your coworkers. Sometimes it's just the job interactions with staff itself, or the administrative process that causes so many of these paper cuts, of these 1,000 paper cuts. Have you seen that throughout your career as well?
You bet. So we speak a lot when we talk about wellness on the job. We talk a lot about, again, very obvious things like post-traumatic stress and moral injury, right? But let's just talk about simple job stress, right? You know, it's got nothing to do with gory images or a fight in the streets or protests and defunding police. But it's the fact that I work in our records division, or I work in dispatch, and there's friction. So friction between coworkers, the friction between employees and supervisors, the friction between that the process involves, whatever the process might be. It could be an internal affairs process, as maybe there's a complaint levied against you, or the process of a very legitimate use of force on the street, but it's got to be reviewed, right? So the process of whatever the process might be, it's got nothing to do with post-traumatic stress and images and moral injury and protests, but it's just day in and day out job-related stress. And you bet that's going to have an impact on your emotions, and an impact on your emotions can impact you physically. It can impact you psychologically. And as all of these things start to chip away at your ethical decision-making capabilities. So I guess I should add this. I think the ability to make ethical decisions is as vulnerable as my firearm skills. So the skill to make these decisions is as vulnerable as my skill to shoot a firearm, as my skill to punch or kick, my skills in self-defense, as my skills in physical fitness. The more I practice these things, the better I'm going to be at it. So the more I practice my ethical decision-making process, the better I'm going to be at it. The more I ignore these things, the worse I'm going to be at it. My proficiency is going to diminish. So I feel like our ethical decision-making process is a perishable skill, and we need to be practicing them and strengthening them all along the way.
And this would speak to why people, even on SWAT details or SAU, SRT, CIT, CNT, you have to practice, and as you practice things, then you make sure that you fall back to your level of training, right?
Correct. So let me look at exactly, and that's the positive side of the coin. I am putting positive input quite often results in positive output. So let's look at the other side of the coin, which is the negative side of the coin. And it's this theory I call the Grand Canyon theory. So if I were to ask, I don't know if you and I have talked about this before, but the question is this: how many people accidentally, and that's the key term here, accidentally fall into the Grand Canyon on a yearly basis? Take a guess.
So I would say 1,000.
1,000? You have very little faith in human. We must all be morons. So the term, but the key word is accidentally, right? Yeah. Lots of people intentionally jump into the Grand Canyon because they're ending everything, right? So that happens. There are like work-related accidents and stuff like that. But on an annual basis, and I looked this up about a year ago, so my numbers are off by a year. On average, annually, 2 to 3 people accidentally fall into the largest hole on the planet. All right, so I can understand tripping into a pothole you didn't see, but you accidentally fell into the Grand Canyon. You can see that thing from space.
Yeah.
So then we research why. How did that happen? And the 2 biggest reasons are reckless and complacency. So with the advent of that cell phone, right, one of the increases on accidental trip and falls into the Grand Canyon was backing themselves up too far to take that selfie. You're complacent and reckless, you fall in. And or you're getting closer and closer and closer to the edge. You're complacent and reckless, and you fall in. So if I take the Grand Canyon theory and I bring it to work with me, and I say that police officers nationwide are experiencing a lot of negativity. We always have. So we work around poverty, and we work around people with mental illnesses, and we work around prostitution, and we work around drugs, and we work around alcohol, and we seem to be type A personalities that like adrenaline. At some point in time, the things that are around us start to influence our own character. And like the Grand Canyon, we start to get a little closer and closer out of interest, out of curiosity, out of recklessness, out of complacency. We get too close to the edge, and we find ourselves making bad decisions because we spent years training ourselves or exposing ourselves to negativity.
No, that's an amazing theory.
And we become complacent. Yeah, and it's just mine. It could be, I just made that up.
No, it makes
what?
I buy into it. It makes total sense.
Yeah, so I also have this theory that we spend days, weeks, months, years building and strengthening ourselves to make an instant ethical decision that comes up, and we have to make it quickly, right? Or we spend years not strengthening ourselves, weakening our experience, weakening our skills, and when it's time to make that decision, we're not prepared for it, and we might make a bad decision.
Yeah, you're making my brain work in so many ways here. So I'm hearing complacency as being one major factor, and you're saying that the ethical decision pool is as big as the Grand Canyon, and sometimes that complacency, as obvious as it would be to us, sometimes if we were paying attention, it could oftentimes dissipate, and we might make bad choices.
And what is not paying attention? Not paying attention means I am not self-aware and I am not self-regulating.
Yeah, yeah, no,
Right. That's the complacency part. Is I've become complacent about the conditions I'm working in. I do nothing to fix it. I feel the moods impacting I feel these emotions around me impacting my own,
mm-hmm.
and I do nothing to correct it or heal it.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, I find myself so eroded and emotionally disgruntled that I make poor decisions or I exhibit poor conduct, and it gets us in trouble.
Well, and making those is a safety issue, right? Is a safety issue for the officer who's trying to take things. Here's another thing that you probably have paid attention to as well, because in your training capacity. So we have complacency, and then something that really concerns me, especially now, is hesitancy. Is officers who may have been based upon, a past of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
talked about so many traumas over time, and now they are hesitant, especially in this climate, to actually do policing because they're afraid of being, prosecuted or persecuted for something that they did on their job, and that officer is putting himself at risk in terms of safety, but is based upon history as well as current events. Have you found yourself in that position or seen people in that position?
Fortunately, I have not found myself in a position to hesitate in anything that would cost me in terms of safety and security. I think in part because I am a use of force instructor and have been for a long time, and my knowledge and skill in the topic is pretty deep and broad. So, and that's a great point. Maybe that's a great point to make, is the better trained you are, the more confident you're going to be on the streets, doing the job you're doing. So you can avoid hesitation. Also, here at Chandler, we have great community support and we have positive leadership. So even in this condition, even in these current conditions, as an agency, we're getting a lot of external support and we have a lot of internal support as well. So the bulk of the people working around me directly seem to be pretty positive that way, but it doesn't mean that thousands of officers nationwide are feeling left out in the rain and exposed. And my advice to anybody who feels exposed by the process, right? I hesitate because I don't want to be persecuted or prosecuted, is this: train yourself to have a deep knowledge and deep skills, broad knowledge and broad skills, so that you can work with confidence, you can perform your job with confidence, understand and not just understand your process. So here's job skills, right? Understand be clear about what the process is in terms of having internally your performance reviewed. If you know how, say, your use of force is reviewed at your agency, get to know it. Know how it's reviewed, and also research the numbers. I would imagine, much like here at my agency, most agencies and their use of force review process, what officers do is sanctioned and approved far more often than it's not. And then the bigger concept of what will the public and or the media think of this has to come down to, it's out of your control. It come down to that. If wondering what the media or the community will think of my actions, especially in terms of in conditions where my safety is at risk, if that makes you hesitate, that could be a fatal flaw. That could be a fatal decision. So you let that go. Probably easier said than done, but you have to understand that's completely out of your circle of influence on how they're perceived outside of your agency. So let it go.
Mhm. Thank you. How do we keep, you had mentioned this a while back, but how do we keep motivation up for people who feel like they are not making a difference right now? And, maybe some of the traumas that they've experienced previously are riding on their shoulders now more heavily than before. And they just feel down in the dumps and they don't want to show up for
Mhm.
work, or they're afraid to expose themselves to unnecessary risk. What would you say to them, having so many years of tenure in the job?
So you have to be intentional. You as an individual have to intentionally seek out the evidence that you are supported, and that that you do have a positive reputation as an individual, as an agency, and as a profession. So you have to be very intentional about that. If you sit back and wait to hear the good stories and the positive stories, then they more than likely will pass you by. So seek them out.
Mhm.
As an agency, you have to be intentional. Chandler Police Department does a really nice job of, on a very regular basis, we get emails sent to everybody. And in those emails are excerpts from external emails from the community about positive things on how they support us. Our Facebook feed is filled with positive imagery from the community on how they support us. So when it comes to, first of all, when it comes to motivation, understand this. I think I've got this right. Motivation is internal.
Mhm.
Motivation is an internal source of energy, so to speak, right? I can be influenced by external sources, but if they fall into the ears and the eyes of me with zero internal motivation, I'm
Mhm.
probably not very far. Which means that if motivation is internal, then motivating me is up to me.
Mhm.
Seek it out and be intentional.
Mhm.
As leaders, supervisors, leaders, agencies as a whole, be intentional about influencing your officers and tapping into their motivation by letting them know, giving them all those examples of support that are out there. So don't be complacent. So how to keep your motivation? How do you keep morale? Don't be complacent. Don't wait for it to come to you. Seek it out and be intentional about it.
I like that. And so you're saying don't fall prey to confirmation bias and to just seeking out negative things to confirm that what you believe is true, right? It's almost like
Yes.
a battle with yourself to reach beyond that and pull for the positivity so you could start to see other things as well and open your scope so that way you don't become pessimistic. You stay broad and optimistic, realizing that there's positive and negative.
Not too long ago, you and I had another conversation, and you had a good analogy of us at work, officers at work, and here's our norm, and then things go bad and we veer off, and we're living in tough times, right?
Mhm.
So we're over here very intentionally do things that bring you back to norm.
Mhm.
Same time, our agencies, our supervisors, our leaders, like mine does, have got a lifeline connected to you as well.
Mhm.
So I'm working to bring me back to norm. Negative experiences, rough waters. This is where I am now. I'm working to bring myself back to normal, and my agency's got some lifelines in place and some life vests for me that helping me bring me back to normal as well.
Yeah, so your experience, I mean, after working 24 years, as you said, you've been exposed to traumatic events. So there is a difference between being exposed to traumatic events versus being traumatized by them, right? But I feel as though most folks tend to blend those things, thinking that because you've seen, or had to extract a child from a really awful situation, that you will automatically be traumatized by it. Uh, I like to make sure that people understand that you could be exposed to traumas, but you don't necessarily have to develop post-traumatic stress disorder from it. You could have an acute stress issue, which could last a month or less, and then you could be fine. You don't have to develop post-traumatic stress disorder from it. A big topic that we talk about now is post-traumatic stress injury. I like to use that term a lot more now than post-traumatic stress disorder, because I don't know that people feel comfortable having a disorder. You know, I know I wouldn't, right? So as we talk about injury, I think it puts the onus back on this is a job-related specific injury that occurred, you know. And even though we may have payers who may not want to hear that terminology, I think it is important for us to utilize that correct term. Now, on your in your experience, would you say that you've experienced post-traumatic injury on your job? And if so, you know, if you don't mind sharing with us how you were able to process that to get back on track with your life as a, you know, to be healthy in your family. I'd love to hear that perspective.
The audio there broke a bit, but I think I've got the gist. Post-traumatic stress injury versus disorder, and I agree with you. I don't like the term disorder anyways either, but I've been trying hard not to use it as I refer to it. So I'll start with, well, again, my story is a cumulative exposure to lots of difficult things to manage at an emotional, psychological way, right? My very first, going back in time to my training days, I'm in training. I am the brand new rookie. I'm the new guy being trained by my FTO at that time. Dar, my first traffic accident ever as a police officer was a fatality, and it was a child fatality. But it was not my last fatality. So it was difficult to deal with for sure. But it was not at the time. You see, I was a new police officer. I was young. I was semi-robotic. I was being trained, and I was given direction on what to do and where to go. And at that moment in time, there was no time to consider the images I was digesting and what kind of stain they're leaving on my memory. But this is what it did though. For 10 years or more, I dreamt of it. Mm-hmm. I had about that event, about that accident, about the images that were there, and just like I said, that wasn't my last fatal wreck. That's not my only dream of other traumatic events. So, not saying I was having nightmares. I did developing into a disorder type of thing, but for a decade or so, I had reoccurring dreams of that specific fatal accident with that young boy involved. And at the same time, the grief that mom and aunt were feeling because the kid was taken out of the car seat because he was crying so much, and to comfort the kid, the aunt was holding the kid in the front seat on her lap, relatively minor fender bender, but when the child ended up being killed in the accident. So imagine the grief the mom and aunt are in as well. That stuck with me as well, on how humans suffer, how humans grieve when they are hit with trauma. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like a secondary trauma from another person.
Well, and you know, it's funny because you talk about, I love this example, and you know, that you bring up, because it's such a relatable type of issue that could happen to anybody. When you and I were growing up, before we had seatbelt laws, and even before cars had seatbelts in them, right? Mm-hmm. You know, you were probably like me, even though we grew up in different places. You would probably climb on the back dash of the car. Mm-hmm. We would ride in a station wagon trunk. You know, we would do really things that were normal back then that we wouldn't do now. Now, granted, there may be tons more cars on the road than when we were growing up. But I think, you know, for a parent who has a screaming child in the car, and I know we've been there too, it is so common that a parent might be tempted or want to take the child out to either breastfeed in the car as they're driving, or to you know, comfort the child. And so what experience that you saw, which, you know, I always say that the relatable types of calls are the ones that stick the most, because, maybe, at the time, maybe you weren't there, maybe you didn't do that, maybe it wasn't part of your family stuff, but it can happen to anybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me go back a generation. My father was a police officer, and he took a medical retirement, but before that, he was working the road, and he was on a motorcycle as a traffic officer. And he was investigating a fatal collision. And by the time he got to the scene, the deceased child had been taken from the scene and was at the hospital. So eventually, my dad made it to the hospital to follow up on things. And he gets there, and the child was already deceased. But the hand, part of the arm and the hand, are exposed from the blanket that they had over the child. This was probably 1981, 1982. I was about 10. And the first thing my dad saw when he saw that young boy's arm underneath that sheet was my hand. Like, he's like, my hand underneath that sheet. And let's go back to the Grand Canyon. And this is, again, the 70s and 80s in law enforcement. No one stopped for a moment to talk about officer wellness. Officer therapy was probably beers after work, right? This was the 70s and 80s in law enforcement. And I can only try and put myself in my dad's shoes at the time, and having been a police officer for about years, the wear and the tear of the job, the emotions, and I relate what I lived as a police officer and the emotions I feel and the impact of them on me to how that might have occurred to my dad. Well, my dad, the Grand Canyon, complacency, being not taking care of yourself and your ethical decision-making process, loses his cool and grabs the guy that's also at the hospital being treated for injuries, grabs the guy by the collars, shouts, screams, some profanity. His buddy's there, helps him step back. But that's my dead son underneath that sheet. I've got a 10-year-old. You just killed a 10-year-old. I haven't cared for myself emotionally as a police officer, and it goes off. And I think that's an example of, if you don't care for your decision-making skills and self-regulate your moods and keep yourself healthy, then it could risk the decisions you make in the future. And that happened to my dad. So super glad I've been able to avoid that, but I haven't been able to avoid the injury, the post-traumatic injury, the stress injury you're talking about. And I think it's important to tell my dad, if I could go back in time, to tell me, even as a younger officer, and to anybody else listening, is the injuries we occur related to trauma are as normal and expected as the broken fingers, the twisted ankles, any other bumps and bruises we get taken care of on the job, doing what we do. They are normal. My emotional injury is as normal and should be as expected as all the other injuries we know we come across.
Yeah, it doesn't make you less than in any means at all. It's just part of the job, and it's part of your experience working in this field.
Agreed.
Dan, you and I could keep talking for 2 more hours here, but I know we both have things to do the rest of the day. I want to give you an opportunity to give me some parting words of inspiration and hope, because you know where I come from and what I stand for. Our mission here is to really make sure that we save lives, especially our first responder lives. That getting through post-traumatic stress injury is possible. I think you'll live in proof of that, and I know you only took a fraction of the that you've been on. So give me some inspiration and some hope so we can wrap up this segment, and we'll do more of this.
Yeah, that sounds good. I know you and I both have got lots of things we want to talk about. I just said one of the things I want to make sure everyone knows is the injury related to trauma is as normal and as expected as any other type of bumps or bruise or broken bone you might experience on the job. don't feel like you're less of an officer, less of a dispatcher. Don't feel like you're not handling this. You got to man up. That's not real. You would go have your sprained ankle looked at, heal your traumatic injuries as well. The other aspect I want to make sure everyone heard was be intentional about caring for yourself. Self-regulation and self-awareness is self, right? Agencies across the nation should be working hard at providing officer wellness, employee wellness opportunities. Unfortunately, employees don't always take advantage of them. So be intentional about that. And the last thing is just one more story. Cumulative PTS injury, right? Cumulative PTS injury is a bigger topic than yourself. So it involves, it's your employer, it's your coworkers, it involves your family and friends. Not too long ago, my wife and I are chilling in the backyard, floating in the pool, and we're talking about something, and my wife starts to cry. And she's talking because right now things are really great. It was like a great day. And she's crying because a couple years ago, it wasn't. And the injury my wife has, the trauma related injury my wife has accumulated over time, related to my poor behavior or moods or emotions at home, related to my trauma injury. It's like the circle, right? So it was a great, not necessarily reminder, because it might have been the first time it fell on my head like bricks, that, oh man, all this stuff I've been talking about lately, about what has happened to me and how to heal myself and how to heal law enforcement professionals. My wife is teared up because she's happy that we are happy, because not too long ago we weren't. And it was related to me. I caused that. So the idea of keeping yourself well and healthy is not just for you. It's a bigger picture. Your family and your friends and your spouses and your coworkers will appreciate it as well.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that personal experience too. That's the stuff that really counts, and that's what matters for your retirement plan. So thank you, Dan. Thanks for being real.
You're welcome.
A lot of people are going to probably relate directly to you. So we will continue this conversation. Stay safe, and to everybody else who is seeing this video, please know that there is hope, and you have places like the 100 Club that has the fireproof and the bulletproof apps that you could access for free. You have a lot of resources where you could have confidential chats with people through text messages. And I believe one of them is a crisis text line, which is 741-741, and you text Blue to that, and then you end up talking to people who are culturally competent. You have Cop Line, Cop to Cop. You have just a variety of IAFF has resources for firefighters. And then if you ever get stuck, give me a call or shoot me a text. My cell phone number is all over the internet, 602-345-1425. And I will be happy to get you to a resource as well. I know that we have a lot of people across the country who really care about our first responders and trying to do the right thing to preserve life and get you the help that you need. So thank you for everybody watching today, and we will look forward to continuing this on later on. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.